Can you hear me? Whoa, I think you can. It's really, really special for me to be here. When I was 24, I sort of, in a moment of total frustration, decided, you know what, screw it, I am going to be an artist. and I'm going to do that by being a writer, and who's going to help me? And I accidentally found out about the MFA program here and thought, well, that's the only place that will help me do that. And you know, fortunately, got in and came and met Ann and Kenji, who's here, and many other amazing people, and it did really change my life. So to be back here in the regular season, reading to you all is at Ann's invitation is really, really special. So thank you for coming. Anne suggested that maybe I would read a little bit from each of my books, and I will do that with some trepidation only because normally, I mean, I sort of, I think I started writing longer poems because I don't like this part of like talking before and between poems. I usually just read one like 15-minute poem and like that's the reading. But instead of doing that, because I have a little longer, I am going to read a little bit from the first book and a whole poem from the second book and then a whole poem from the third book. So, and I'd rather sort of make if I have anything intelligent to say, hopefully I'll say it if there are any questions, because otherwise, I don't know. I think the thematic connections between these books are pretty clear. I think knowledge and fallibility and desire are sort of the things that everything circles around, and each book kind of is focused on a different relation to those things. So the first one is sort of the I and the lyric, and the second one is sort of maybe a little bit didacticism, partly because it works with some texts, which I'll talk about for 1 second then. And the third one is really about relationality, they and we, and is the most anxiety-producing of all, but maybe just because it's the newest. But the very first poem in the very first book I will read. It's short. My first two books have a little poem in the front by way of introduction, and this is this one from I Have Not Been Able to Get Through to Everyone. The poem itself is untitled. I can't remember what it is I'm supposed to be doing. I can't think of anything but lists I've made, lists I've broken the spirit of. It's always a fine time for breaking things like plastic forks and poetic trends. It's a damn good morning to imitate the world. But I can't remember what imitation is, or the difference between it and flattery, or an adage and an aphorism. I'd better go back to school, he said, performing a gesture to alterity. I can't remember if alterity has negative connotations, or is just another way of kicking myself out the door. I'd like to try being a man for once. I'd like to wear chaps and have it be obscene instead of pornographic. I can never remember what I think of pornography when it isn't in my face. I wish I could be inanimate, banged up and appreciated for all my surface qualities without ethics getting in the way. I seem to remember being ethical. I seem to act along some kind of line, albeit a kinky one. I wonder when kinky became pornographic and whether that aspect is subtractable. I don't remember my grammar rules. I don't think English is very good for a certain kind of inventioning. I gather some readers don't like being confronted with a language in every word. I want to be a word. I would be abstract with an inscrutable ending. The central poem of this book, sort of in the center of it, and also the one that sort of made me commit to this as the book. I had a whole different book that was my first book that got completely disassembled and replaced with this one. One reason it took so long is called The Blue Book, and it was my answer to the question, what do I know to be true? I'm just going to write down a bunch of things that I know to be true. And it was at a moment when I really had no idea that I would be able to write down any sentences in response to that. The Blue Book is also a book written by Wittgenstein, and I have sort of had a love affair with Wittgenstein for a long time. So I'm just going to read the first few passages from this one, and then I'll move on. The Blue Book. There are more trees here than I know what to do with. I don't know any of their names with certainty. My own name has stuck with me since I was very young. I remember the day I learned to spell it with certainty. There are ways to distinguish the trees from each other. These distinctions seem fixed, like the difference between the sexes. How I describe the distinctions varies, though. It seems to become more detailed as I notice more details. First, I notice the leaves, and then I notice the bark. This is a kind of progress or progression. I notice color first, then shape, then texture. At least, that is how it seems to me on reflection. Progression seems less problematic as a concept than progress. I wonder if that is because it lacks connotations of value. I wonder why value as a concept seems problematic. The introduction of new concepts seems a progression, but toward what? The tree's limbs extend toward nothing or toward each other. The texture of the bark is in a language I don't know. The bark changes in appearance as I progress toward it in space. A language changes in appearance as I learn to decipher its characters. A character marked by difference is never decipherable with certainty. A character marked by familiarity is deciphered with tender certainty. Reflection sheds a problematic light on the concept false. The distance between the concept false and the concept certainty is changeable. The distance between two trees remains constant at the base, but not between limbs. It is therefore both certain and changeable. Many people change their names. Afterward, they are not seen as different by most people. They may have private or public reasons for changing their names. They may change names to buck or bolster tradition, for example. The change may or may not, in fact, buck or bolster tradition. Some people change their sex. They may have private or public reasons for doing so. Afterward, they are seen as different by most people. Some traditions only become buckable with progress. Sex is a noun that can be both active and descriptive. A view of sunlight filtering through trees can seem corny or kitsch. Sex seems to retain the ability to be experienced non-ironically. This may be due to the doubling inherent in sex with another person. Irony may be inherent rather than apparent in this doubling. Heterosexual couples may experience a stronger/weaker doubling than homosexual couples. Couples in which one person takes on the other's name seem to be addressing this doubling. I wonder what that does for them. Name is a word that can be both active and descriptive. Like many people, I like hearing my name spoken during sex. A feeling of intimacy after sex can often be mutual and sincere. This can be true even in a setting of filtered sunlight. Intimacy is only possible because people are seen as different. My name comes from my father's side of the family. I sometimes wish I had a different name or no name at all. I sometimes imagine what sex would be like in a world without names. Pick a background. What background do you want? The sentences are out of the order of progression. The choice is between the beach or the bar. The waves are both apparition and decision. A which wave decision can precipitate a crash. A crash can send you decisively to the bar. Pick one, an apple or apparition. If unjustified, the imperative seems premature. An apple is told to mature by something. It can be seen maturing against its background. The bar can create a background of temptation. The apple also has temptation as its background. Apparitions wash up on the shore of difference. In the filtered sunlight, they enliven their background. Different bars can offer similar backgrounds. A crash can wash you up in one of them. The same beach can offer different backgrounds. The difference depends on the progression of sunlight. A dark beach begins to resemble a bar. This resemblance is an apparition based on the progression toward sex. If unjustified, this resemblance can seem immature. Many backgrounds for the progression toward sex seem corny or kitsch. The beach and the bar are decisively among them. The cultural background dictates certain decisions. These often take on the texture of an apparition or crash. The tree of progress is seen as being rooted in sexual immaturity. Pick a person to have sex with most often. What person do you want? I think I'll stop with that one there. So, moving on. The second book, You and Three Others Are Approaching a Lake, was written in response to the first book. That's what happens. But it came about. I was going on a trip to Russia and knew I was going to have some time on my hands because I was sort of tagging along with a group, and I brought one random book that I had bought at the junk store with me because I liked the title, Death as a Way of Life. And I gave myself as an assignment just to write a poem kind of using that book in some way. So I did that, and I liked that process. So then I always have stacks of these books whose titles I like, and so I picked a few others and started writing with them, and 4 of those poems ended up in this book. So, and they were all very didactic books from the early 20th century up until basically the year of my birth, all by white men telling you something. So this is this book also starts with a very short prefatory poem called Prologue. The problem is I don't care whether I convince you or not. In a perfect world, I would be able to convince you of this. Everybody should always have a position on everything. We take our positions with us, like folding stools to the beach. The stools, when we abandon them, fade to the same color. And I will go with you to the end of this argument, as I have gone with you to the beach, and the man with the cooler will walk by selling streets, and we will pick a street to carry us home. We'll pick the one with the best loved name, a flower or a state or October the 12th, because each date must be celebrated somewhere in this world, each moment of courage or loss or revolution, when something pushed something and something fell down. I'm doing a time check. I didn't pay attention to when we started, but I did time this, so we should be okay. So I'm going to read one other poem from this book. It's one that Ann quoted from a little bit in the introduction. It's called The Tragedy of Waste. And the source text for this, from which I take a lot of the facts and some of the language, is a book called The Tragedy of Waste that was published in 1925 in conjunction with the Labor Bureau. And it was sort of a social science kind of treatise talking about efficiency during and after World War I, and kind of lamenting how after the necessity for certain kinds of wartime efficiency went away, then so did all of those practices, and we became just as wasteful as we have been. and the book itself starts with a sort of one of these political philosophy kind of thought experiments, where it's like, right, do you kill this person who's your best friend to let those 5 million people live, those kinds of things. But this one has to do with a lake. The Tragedy of Waste. You and 3 others are approaching a lake. You have 2 canoes, your tent, your axes. It is after 6. What, precisely, is your procedure? To be fed, to keep warm and dry. One had brought back poisonous toadstools. One had lain down on the beach, had cut down tall trees for. We start not with theory, but with tangible performance. Enter the world, a species already sufficiently inured to tragedy. At the beginning of 1917, there were housewives, children, old people, sick people, fields, factories, stores, offices, food, shelter, and clothing. Modern industrialism, the slums of the great cities, reasonable comforts. We entered with 40 million workers, warriors, uniforms and boots. We made graphs, were surprised on the home front. The house went up faster with 3 men than with 4. What miracle occurred? No miracle. You are approaching a lake. You have canoes, tent, axes. The heroine says, we shall first try to secure an aeroplane view of our own. This taxes the imagination. Too many studies have begun and ended in the middle. The businessman is beginning to think. The engineer knows it. The good Republican knows it. From these definitions, one must pick and choose. You are plunged into a field, a quiet, celestial eyesight, an aeroplane view. Suppose that Mr. David Friday and Sir Leo Chiozza Money had had their way, flickered for a moment, and then went out under the cold douche. Suppose that instead of killing Germans, the organization had been directed to the killing of malnutrition, slum dwelling, shoddy clothing, infant mortality, occupational disease, starved opportunity, illiteracy, and ignorance, for example. This plunges us into a field, some 100 million men, women, and children, in relation to these things. What are those 600,000 people in the advertising business up to, for instance? A housewife tries to get her chores done in the morning so she can go to a matinee in the afternoon. With these principles in mind, set down as waste the production of non-essentials, idleness, bad technical methods, the case of the camping party on page 1, the poisonous toadstools, the beach. There are 5 elements involved in the theory, and we will consider each of them briefly. Human wants, wastes in consumption, idle manpower, wastes in the technique of production and distribution, the waste of natural resources. Human wants. First, the necklace of bone, then the shift of leather, tea, tobacco, and gambling. In other words, 10 men could live on the corn where only 1 can live on the beef. Wastes in consumption, or ilth. It has been said, following Ruskin, that the production of base forms of art in painting, music, the drama, literature, the plastic arts must necessarily entail the highest human costs, the largest loss of human welfare, individual and social. For such an artist poisons not only his own soul but the social soul, adulterating the food designed to nourish the highest faculties of man. In other words, language. It is fun to watch, but it is even more fun to play. Or more than 2,000 persons have been killed in theater collapses in the past 10 years. Or adulteration packed the life preservers of the General Slocum with sawdust instead of cork as she sank with all on board. More ilth. We are not concerned with who pays for it, but with the thing itself. If it is a beautiful thing, it is not waste, but outside the field of art, a pile of sound comforts and a pile of wanton extravagance. 2 canoes, your axes. I would like an explanation of these canoes and axes. Someone somewhere is approaching. There is a lake, the concept of supply and demand, a war with which to compete. Who among you will not use the axe? Who will forsake the lake? It's been said a functional society would not abolish sexual irregularities, and could not if it would. Of course, law of difference, law of diminishing return, or the lake does not have to be the next last stop. Did you ever think you could stay where you are, irregular? The canoe turned over is a house. Idle manpower. From the aeroplane view, it was noted that certain adults were doing nothing. Men are not idle because they want to be. We cannot always be successful. Because he dislikes his job, the total, the United States. They are temporarily laid off, seasonally laid off, cyclically laid off. They are out of work for an average period as they change from job to job. Needless agony. You have your tent, your canoes, a species already. Wastes in production. In the war, all this was beginning to change. The belting, the power load, the lubricating and cooling devices, the handling of supplies, and the physical motions of the men who run the tools. What pain is to a human body, the most efficient machine. In the printing industry, there is only 1 apprentice for every 10 journeyman printers, a condition the engineers term industrial suicide. Example, example, example. We confess it is with sorrow that we see a child enter upon this desert. An analysis of advertising. Ride on trains, stay at home more, use more coffins. Eat more bread, drink more milk, eat more butter, eat more cheese. Eat more meat, goal 179 pounds per capita per year, the level attained in 1900. The eye is caught and often it is pleased. We must pick and choose. Smiling faces, shining teeth, schoolgirl complexions, cornless feet, perfect-fitting union suits, distinguished collars, wrinkleless pants, odorless breaths, regularized bowels, happy homes in New Jersey, 15 minutes from Hoboken, charging motors, punctureless tires, perfect busts, shimmering shanks, self-washing dishes, backs behind which the moon was meant to rise. Industrial coordination, star-crossed love. Finally, he arose and said, "These great varieties of styles to choose from do not reflect the wishes of the consumer. In the resulting gulf, untold men and women submerged and lost through failure, ignorance of supply and demand, the seasonal cycle of rush months and dull months, uncertain sales, uncertain sources." We could go on indefinitely. No personal stricture is possible. Put it out of reach, naive intelligence of a boy, I will confess. Wastes in distribution. Is he? How much? Has it? Well then, we'll smash it. There is no internal price system. Mother does not charge for frying eggs, nor father for shaking down the furnace. Behind the desk there is a window. A woodpecker is attacking the house. The sun is attacking the snow on the pavement. Everything helping itself to everything else. Natural resources, the gutting of a continent. You and 3 others are approaching a lake. The day of the pioneer may have passed its noon, but it still runs strong. It is after 6. What is your procedure? The history of the material conquest of America largely parallels the history of every other rich and virgin area. Free experimentation, trial and error, no job for academic philosophers. Those hunters who slew bird and lynx as their stomachs and their safety demanded. Is it more than you would have done? The error is material. It's an island ahead. You are already in the lake. An oil well is a hole in the ground about 1/4 of a mile deep into which a man may put a small fortune or out of which he may take a big one. There were housewives, children, shelter and clothing, reasonable comforts. The island turned over is a canoe. The challenge to start not with theory, but with tangible performance. You and others approaching. We shall be asked for a way out, to be fed, to keep warm and dry. Starting with experience, magic, genuine science. More than once we have been lost in a trackless wilderness, dwarfed and shadowed by mighty buildings, subway trains, wild as elephants. One goes blindly back to one's desk. These moments come, their dark shadow. We glimpsed control and more tragic waste. We entered with 40 million warriors with the dignity of cathedrals. The lake is upon you. You have 2 canoes, your tent. The child has entered upon this desert. You have your axes. What precisely is your procedure? I'm going to read one tiny page of another poem in this book because I feel like it really embarrassingly encapsulates, you know how people say you write the same book over and over again? This is pathetically my version of that, I think. And it's the first page of the poem, Death as a Way of Life. It began, 1, life is not fair. 2, how can I be happy while others suffer? 3, how can I not be happy while others suffer? 4, others will suffer whether or not I am happy. 5, it is not the suffering of others that causes my happiness. 6, it is not the not suffering of others that causes my unhappiness. 7, the not suffering of others would not prevent my happiness. 8, I have been attracted to the idea that naming is a form of violence, but does that mean we should go around calling everyone, hey you, which seems like another sort of violence, even though it is a way of recognizing the other as other? What can be said on this point? So do we have one more poem in us? Okay. It's going to be a little bit, but not too long. Okay, we're good. Okay, so this new book They and we will get into trouble for this is my last long title. And it has 3 long poems and a 4th that runs across the bottom, which sometimes when I'm reading I try and sort of scoop up from it, but I don't know if that will work with this particular poem, so that may not happen. It's loosely structured in a kind of paradiso, limbo, hell way, so I'm going to read the middle poem, which is the limbo poem. And I've never read this in full, but I've read parts of it a lot, and some people in this room have probably heard the first parts of it, so I'm sorry for the repetition. I don't know how it's going to work trying to read from this book where there's only 3 poems, and they're all really long, but anyway, we'll find out. I read this quite quickly, so that's just how it is. It's called What It Means to Be Avant-Garde, which is a title I stole from David Anton. I feel sad. I feel discouraged about the future. I feel I have failed more than the average person. As I look back on my life, all I can see is a lot of failures. I don't get real satisfaction out of anything anymore. I am dissatisfied or bored with everything. I feel quite guilty most of the time. I expect to be punished. I am disgusted with myself. I am critical of myself for my weaknesses or mistakes. I blame myself for everything bad that happens. I have thoughts of killing myself, but I would not carry them out. I would like to kill myself. I would kill myself if I had the chance. I don't cry any more than usual. I used to be able to cry, but now I can't cry even though I want to. I am no more irritated by things than I ever was. I am slightly more irritated now than usual. I have lost all of my interest in other people. I make decisions about as well as I ever could. I can't make decisions at all anymore. I am worried that I am looking old or unattractive. I feel there are permanent changes in my appearance that make me look unattractive. I have to push myself very hard to do anything. I don't sleep as well as I used to. I wake up several hours earlier than I used to and cannot get back to sleep. I get tired from doing almost anything. My appetite is not as good as it used to be. My appetite is much worse now. I have lost more than 5 pounds. I have lost more than 15 pounds. I am worried about physical problems like aches, pains, upset stomach, or constipation. I am very worried about physical problems, and it's hard to think of much else. I have not noticed any recent change in my interest in sex. I have lost interest in sex completely. I was in the park when they called, with my head on my knee and my nose in a book. The book was by David Anton, an American. There are many ways to follow a thought. When the phone rang, they told me they wanted me. There was a voice on the phone that belonged to a man. It sounded like a man and him saying they wanted me. I read a book the other day by a circus performer. In my youth, I read a book by an anthropologist's son who ran off with the gypsies with his parents' blessing. The anthropologist's son was not an American. American parents don't say yes. You can run off with the gypsies because it might be interesting. Of course, I don't know all of them. The circus performer was unstable emotionally. She committed suicide at the age of 42. The man said, "We want you to come in for some tests." The parents hoped the boy would grow up to write a book in which he would detail the functioning of Roma culture. Before the phone rang, I was reading the bit in the Anton about how it's a good thing to be on the fringe. He found they lie to everyone except to their own. Coterie makes you soft. When I went in for the tests, they said I was normal, and only after I did a lot of research on the internet did I come to understand what they meant by that was that my condition is unexplained. I feel downhearted and blue most of the time. Morning is when I feel the best some of the time. I have crying spells or feel like it good part of the time. I have trouble sleeping at night a little of the time. I eat as much as I used to good part of the time. I still enjoy sex a little of the time. I notice that I am losing weight some of the time. I have trouble with constipation a little of the time. My heart beats faster than usual some of the time. I get tired for no reason good part of the time. My mind is as clear as it used to be a little of the time. I find it easy to do the things I used to some of the time. I am restless and can't keep still most of the time. I feel hopeful about the future a little of the time. I am more irritable than usual most of the time. I find it easy to make decisions. I feel that I am useful and needed some of the time. My life is pretty full a little of the time. I feel that others would be better off if I were dead most of the time. I still enjoy the things I used to do. I had forgotten the name of the boy who ran with the gypsies. It was mid-morning, and I was sitting at my desk, taking the last sip of my morning decaf with soy. The last sip is always cold and unsatisfying. This was not my first attempt to recover the boy's name. I had, of course, forgotten the book's title as well. I typed Dutch Gypsy Narrative Young Anthropologist into my machine. For 15 years, I've been trying to recall the name of the boy or of the book. I may even have unsuccessfully searched for them before. During those years, I recreated a memory of the narrative. He is beloved by the group and accepted as one of them. He does not miss his parents, though he holds them in high esteem. He learns to sing from a dark-haired man and to steal from a dark-haired girl. The boy himself is as blonde as a broom. The feeling of not knowing is like flying in your dreams. Around the time I started searching, I stopped dreaming I was free. Dutch Gypsy Narrative Young Anthropologist did the trick. His name came up and I remembered it. Recognition makes you fall, but you can try to resist, though you'll make yourself ridiculous flapping all around. I switched windows and searched for my unexplained condition. There are lots of people who have it, and none of them can spell. It turns out I was wrong about my search being successful. The name I thought I recognized was of a different person, an 18th century abolitionist who fell in love with a slave. He slept with many others, but only fell in love once. I did another search, and this time left out nationality. I typed, son of anthropologists runs off with gypsies. When mysteries are explained, they don't exactly disappear. The boy was Belgian, not Dutch, and that had been my mistake. The man called back to say one of my test results was compromised. The title of the book is The Gypsies. Feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge nearly every day, not being able to stop or control worrying more than half the days, worrying too much about different things several days, trouble relaxing more than half the days. Being so restless that it's hard to sit still several days, becoming easily annoyed or irritable nearly every day, feeling afraid as if something awful might. The Gypsies was republished in 1987, a time that still can be called my youth. I was living in Los Angeles waiting for high school to end. My condition would not manifest for another 20 years. In the talk where David Anton discusses life on the fringe, he is in Los Angeles at an art space called Lace. I don't know what year it was, but the talks were collected in a book that was published in 1984. So it's likely the talk took place while I was in junior high, which is what they called middle school back in the day. Growing up in a metropolis can make you soft. I've been going to the same art institutions most of my life. You have the sense you should be heading inevitably for the center. When people ask me where I live, I say in the middle of nowhere. Under certain circumstances, it requires effort to stay on the fringe. The first assumption about gypsies is they make no home. David Anton bought an apartment in Manhattan in '57. It cost him $250 or $18.50 a month. When I moved to Manhattan, it was 1993. I paid $400 a month to live in the East Village. I fell in love with a cook at the restaurant where I waitressed. He carried a knife on the subway because his city was dangerous. He made me feel totally, irrevocably Californian. The blizzard that winter was record-breaking. We spent our nights at the restaurant and our days in the dark room. We woke in strangers' apartments on Avenue D. We buried 2 friends in a matter of months. Sometimes an image moves to the center of a life. His mother and stepfather were trained anthropologists. Looking now at the pictures, I can see we were happy. When we broke up, he asked if I was leaving him for art. Eventually, he became an editor at Rolling Stone. We had a drink at a bar, and I explained my condition. He gave me many books during our 4 years together. One of them was The Gypsies. I can easily tell if someone else wants to enter a conversation. Strongly agree. I prefer animals to humans. Strongly disagree. I try to keep up with the current trends and fashions. Mildly agree. I dream most nights. No answer. I really enjoy caring for other people. I try to solve my own problems rather than discussing them with others. I find it hard to know what to do in a social situation. I am at my best first thing in the morning. It doesn't bother me too much if I am late meeting a friend. I would never break a law, no matter how minor. I often find it difficult to judge if something is rude or polite. I prefer practical jokes to verbal humor. If I see a stranger in a group, I think it's up to them to make an effort to join in. I usually stay emotionally detached when watching a film. I can easily work out what another person might want to talk about. I can tell if someone is masking their true emotion. Before making a decision, I always weigh the pros and cons. I live for today rather than for the future. In The Fringe, David Anton talks about the white light. If you're from a capital city, you may know what he means. If you were born on the fringe, I can't know what you know, despite my high score on the empathy quotient test devised by a doctor named Simon Baron-Cohen, a psychologist from Cambridge with two brothers in showbiz, directors of independent British film. Another white light, bright but not blinding, like the one that shines on their namesake, Sasha, a distant relation of Simon and his brothers. So the white light shines from name to name. Empathy has been theorized in many ways. The first I encountered was that of David Hume, though he doesn't use the word, instead splitting sympathy into a complex mode of experience in which the process of understanding is reversed from impression to idea to impression. There are many ways to think about loss. The gypsies are known to originate in India, not Egypt or Romania as once was believed, thus the misnomer gypsy, which has since been reclaimed. Still, there are gypsies living in India. I've read they make their livings selling broomsticks and tools, except the ones committed to religious begging. Many people from the white light of LA or New York take journeys to India to study yoga, for example. I know some of them, and they are very nice people. I imagine they score high on the empathy quotient test. What I'm trying to get at is impossible to say. The people we bury put us in the ground too, from impression to idea and back again. The grounding is temporary, and we eventually move on. I heard some bad news when I woke up this morning. My condition had faded to the back of my mind. The news came from a friend, a translator from India, a new friend I'd met on the organized fringe. I never knew life would be so much about death. I wrote to him that there were no words for his suffering, a tautological statement with a paradox at its heart. A week ago, we all were sitting together on the grass, indulging in the first warm rays of spring sun. The translator was the only one sitting in the shade. This he attributed to the heat in his country of origin. Calcutta may as well be the middle of nowhere. It never has topped my list of places to visit. Now empathy has made me want to get on a plane. I wonder if this is what Anton means, to be alive in the perfectly reasonable, shabby human light, my hand ahead of my heart, ahead of my hand. Crossed arms, folded arms, defensiveness, reluctance. Crossed arms with clenched fists, hostile defensiveness. Gripping own upper arms, insecurity. One arm across body, clasping other arm by side, female, nervousness. Arms held behind body with hands clasped, confidence, authority. Handbag held in front of body, female, nervousness. Holding papers across chest, mainly male, nervousness. Adjusting cuff, watch strap, tie, etc. using an arm across the body, nervousness. Arms, hands covering genital region, male, nervousness. Holding a drink in front of body with both hands, nervousness. Seated, holding drink on one side with hand from other side, nervousness. Touching or scratching shoulder using arm across body, nervousness. Just as I was getting to the part about Vietnam, I misplaced Anton's book in a series of moves. There was a time when I might just have ordered another, but that was before the economic crash of the aughts, so I am left to imagine what connections should be drawn between the war, the fringe, and the blinding white light. What we know about connections is they're often wrong. In high school, I lived in Athens, Greece, a capital city if there ever was one. The gypsies made their home a few blocks from our apartment, an unofficial country on waterfront land. That was before the economic boom of the 90s and the amenities necessitated by the coming Olympics. During one of my moves, I found a copy of The Tourist, the newer edition with a foreword by Lucy Lepard. The question of staged authenticity had been much on my mind. In her foreword, Lepard admits to having a bad memory, which she relies on to allow her to do some thinking of her own. There are many ways to think about origin. I frequently seek out the assistance of others. I wonder if I will eventually become inured to my condition, the way explorers acclimate to the thin air up high, that fringe of the body's ability to breathe. I woke up in a sweat, convinced I was elsewhere, a tourist attraction at the back of my mind. I dreamed I had found the book I'd misplaced, that I'd read the rest of the piece on the fringe. It was full of war and art and piss, the relationship of markers to sight. I had coffee with a geographer in Boulder, Colorado, the air so thin I was gasping for breath. He'd just returned from another trip to China. We talked about Anton Lepard and my condition. He made me feel totally, irrevocably soft. We'll probably never see
see each other again. Later, I wrote something down in my notebook. It had to do with my questions about being a tourist and something the geographer had smilingly said. Returning is different from covering the same ground. I held my coffee on one side with my hand from the other. Nervousness gestures to feelings fringe. The boy returned to the gypsies every year for a decade. The camp in Athens is now a seaside cafe. If you want to be the one who goes back, go back. I've no theory about how to be. The government should subsidize struggling musicians, theaters, and artists. I am troubled by the eroding distinction between entertainment and marketing. Protesters cause more good than harm. A person cannot be truly spiritual without regularly attending church or temple. Something like the theory of natural selection explains why some people are homeless. If countries are unwilling to cooperate with our military plans, we should treat them as enemies. I feel guilty when I shop at a large national chain. Social justice should be the foundation of any economic system. People shouldn't be allowed to have children they can't provide for. I would defend my property with lethal force. The world would be better if there were no huge corporations. Professional athletes are paid too much money. The separation of church and state has demoralized our society. The word of God exists only as human beings interpret it. We need stronger laws protecting the environment. I would feel better if there were video cameras on most street corners. It should be legal for consenting adults to challenge each other to a duel. I took a break from my condition to start translating a novel, a story about neo-Nazis in Paris, France. It's set in the late 90s when I was living in Paris. The protagonist and I lived on the very same street. Sometimes a place moves to the center of a life. The author of the book is politically on the left. My father lived through the German occupation of Athens. 3 times his home was taken over by soldiers. The novel makes an argument about slippage at the extremes, how it's possible to move effortlessly between far left and far right. It offers as an example one Jacques Doriot, communist mayor in the 30s of Saint-Denis, a suburb of Paris at its northern fringe. My father didn't talk about that part of his childhood. I never could be sure that my impression of it was real. There was one story he liked to tell about that time, the story of Apostolos Santas, a.k.a. Lakis, who scaled the Acropolis in April of 41, tore down the Nazi flag and put nothing in its place, a symbolic act for which he was sentenced to death in absentia. Jacques Doriot turned fascist in 1936. He wore the SS uniform and to his grave. Saint-Denis hosts a campus of the University of Paris. In 1991, I took some classes there. The students it attracted were the self-described fringe. The graffiti on the walls has been painted over since then. I signed up for a class with a man named Voirnet. The title of the class was Philosophy and Art. The name of the professor was spelled like the sunglasses. At the time, you could smoke and drink beer in the classroom. Voirnet kept his inside a brown paper bag. Apostolos Santas did not act alone. He captured the flag with Manolis Glezos, who later led the Coalition for the Radical Left. Apostolos died in 2011, a recipient of medals from the Greek state. Manolis was arrested by Athens riot police as recently as October of 2012. When I was at Saint-Denis, I kept a low profile. Desert Storm was in effect, and I was still an American. I marched for peace and wages with the thousands in the streets, but nothing brought them out like the loss of March the 2nd. Lucien Gainsbourg, the Russian Jew who changed his name to Serge. Sometimes a voice moves the center to a halt. When Lucien was a boy, he wore the yellow star. When he tried to be a singer, he was mocked for his big nose. In the years that followed, he moved as if inevitably toward the center. In 1975, he made an album that satirized the Nazis. There's something I haven't told you that has to do with my condition. The night Serge Gainsbourg died, I heard all of Paris weeping. When I cry for these imperfect things. If someone is crying, you avert your eyes. If you think someone's ugly, you tank top and shorts. If someone picks up a lost purse, you tell them you trust everyone. If your friend asks you who you trust the most, you only if the situation required it. If you are going to church, you wear 10 to 15 times. If you are very religious and someone who follows a different religion preaches to you, in average, how often do you lie a day? Would you tell a white lie to make someone feel better? What saying would you say you most often follow? Which of the following is the correct definition of moral? My condition is rare, but it still affects thousands. It's easy to feel like I'm being punished by God. Not believing in God can have damaging consequences. The source of punishment tends to revert to the self. Self-punishment is the base of many social dynamics. A sense of conscience can be wielded from within or without. The gypsies hold a Kantian belief about ethics. This, according to the European who spent his youth among them, wherein stealing is judged permissible according to intent. It is possible that I can make peace with my condition if I can convince myself its intent is benign. There is a mediation technique called nonviolent communication, conventionally known as NVC. I try to use it in relation to my desire to be cured. The goal is to do away with judgments of value and focus on everyone's needs being met. The relation of gypsy morality to Kant is as follows. For Kant, a right-seeming action is spoiled by an impure intent. This aligns well with the NVC model, in which an act of generosity is immediately voided if revealed to be spurred by resentment or guilt. For the gypsies, stealing is morally neutral, as long as nobody's needs are denied. Take one chicken from the farmer, but not the whole coop. There are many ways to think about dessert. This neutrality is voided when greed enters the picture. NVC holds a broad understanding of violence. It would encompass even my own relation to my condition. My conscience tells me empathy for the self is undeserved. The website contains an inventory of needs. The needs are divided into 7 subsections that begin with connection and end with meaning. This positioning of meaning calls out my condition. My needs are out of date. Acceptance, affection, appreciation, belonging, cooperation, communication, closeness, community. Companionship, compassion, consideration, consistency, empathy, inclusion, intimacy, love. Mutuality, nurturing, respect, self-respect. Safety, security, stability, support. To know and be known, to see and be seen, to understand and be understood. Trust, warmth, air, food, movement, exercise, rest, sleep, sexual expression, safety, shelter, touch, water, authenticity, integrity, presence, joy, humor, beauty, communion, ease, equality, harmony, inspiration, choice, freedom, independence, space, spontaneity, awareness, celebration of life, challenge, clarity, competence, consciousness, contribution, creativity, discovery, efficacy, effectiveness, growth, hope. Learning, mourning, participation, purpose, self-expression, stimulation, to matter, understanding. The title of this poem doesn't come from The Fringe, but from the name of the book in which it appears, and a talk therein that shares that name, that served as a balm when there was no cure. The gypsies have no origin myth, which means they're bonded primarily by language. The Greeks were bonded by language too, the ancients were, and the moderns are. Antons write about the light making it hard to see. My condition has something to do with this. I was wrong about the profession of the Belgian boy's parents. His father was an artist who worked in stained glass, who trained as a painter under Gustave Moreau. His mother, an artsy pacifist type. My father has since told me all he remembers. The boy was a man when he left the gypsies. He was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943. He moved to New York to start a family. By 1959, he was living in Hell's Kitchen. I wonder if he and Anton met on the Fringe. My father's mother marched up and challenged the soldiers. My mother's mother had my condition too. I write to the cook because another friend has died. I type, what would an ethical happiness look like? The Fringe ends with a pail of Guggenheim piss. The list ends with 21 meanings of meaning. I finished the translation, but the work doesn't end. It will end. It moves inevitably toward its end.
That was really long. I'm sorry. But thank you for listening.